Okay, Steve.
You've muted yourself, Hillary.
No, I didn't, but I've just unmuted myself, I think. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, right, fine, thank you. Steve is going to speak for a little while, and then I'll invite anybody who wants to put direct questions to Steve that he can then answer straight away. I'll then invite anybody who doesn't want to ask a direct question but just wants to make a comment to the discussion to join in. And then I'll give Steve some time at the end to sum up, because he might, unless he wants to indicate to me at any point that he's desperate to answer a point made in discussion, he doesn't need to answer every point in the discussion. He can sum up at the end with the last words. Right, is that clear to everybody? Yep, okay, thank you. I now invite Steve, and I'd like to thank him for coming and for all the work he's done to prepare for this meeting and all the study he's done on this topic before today. Thank you. Over to you, Steve.
Hello, yes, I'm going to just open the slideshow. Okay, hello everybody. Can you see the pictures?
Yes.
Right, I'm going to just start the there we go.
You need.
There we go. Yeah. Okay. I'd like to thank everyone for coming along today, and also the Labour History Society for inviting me. I think it was Pat McCluddy, who I see there, who originally suggested that I contact the Society about the research that I was doing. So thanks to her, and to Alan, who's helped set it all up. I'm going to speak about the strike, and then say a little bit about how the strike ended up being part of a much wider movement of industrial unrest and social unrest after the First World War. And then I'll finish by saying a bit about the ways in which we've been trying to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the strike recently. And then very happy to answer questions, as Hillary said. I'd like to say at the beginning that this has been very much a community effort, and I couldn't have done all the work and produced the exhibitions and the other the book and the other information that we've come up with without the help of lots of people, particularly in Eam, Stony Middleton, and in particular my colleague Philip Taylor, who is himself a shoemaker and whose immense knowledge of the footwear trade has been invaluable in helping me understand what took place and then about the history of the trade. So the extraordinary question for me when I first got interested in this dispute was how was it that in two small villages in Derbyshire, in the midst of a war and at the beginning of a massive Spanish flu epidemic, that a strike that lasted for over 2 years took place, and this in an area which didn't have a long history of trade unionism and was quite some distance from the major industrial centres at the time. It seemed a fascinating story to try and unpick, and I've spent some time looking into it, inspired by a book by a woman called Doris Coates, who grew up as a child in Eam and wrote about her childhood, and her father was active in the strike. That's what got me going. So this first slide shows you a group of mainly of women workers in the area at the time in Eyam, and we don't know the exact date of it, but with the help of some local people, we think we've identified at least one of the women in this picture. So we think it must have been taken during the First World War, and the fact that there aren't many men in the picture backs that up as well. So to try and answer the question of why the strike took place, we need to know a little bit about the nature of the footwear trade in Eyam and Stony Middleton at the time, and also the impact of the war locally. And this picture, in a way, helps to answer that question, because you'll notice, if I was in a meeting here, I'll be asking you what you noticed, but since we're all on Zoom, I'll have to pick up the points myself. But you can see it's primarily a group of women, and also some very young women in the picture. And this illustrates the fact that there were already a substantial number of women working in the trade before the war, and also a large number of teenagers, both girls and boys. The lack of many other local employment opportunities and the difficulties of traveling to other places made it easier for employers to pay low wages. There were ready markets, however, in the area. You had a demand for heavy boots in trades such as quarrying, farming, lead and fluorspar mining, and in the foundries and factories of Sheffield, Chesterfield, and other towns nearby. Shoes were in increasing demand as well, and most of the production in these villages was for wholesale manufacturer, with both domestic and export sales. There was quite substantial export trade, particularly to countries in the empire. The other thing to note is that there were factories in both villages, and about 9 significant factories. And I mentioned that might seem an obvious point, but the footwear trade in many villages was much more of a cottage industry and with a lot of outwork. But in these 2 villages, most of it was being done in factories. It was supplemented by outwork, and I'll say something about that later on. But if this picture, which we think was taken just before the First World War, outside one of the main firms in Eyam, it's a company called West. And if you look closely again here, you'll see both a significant number of women workers, but look at the number of young women here on the back row, for example, and at the front. And something like a quarter of the workforce were teenagers. And one of the significant features of this was that the men who had daughters in the village were told by the employers that they needed to bring their daughters in to work as soon as they finished school, because they wanted cheap labor from young girls who could come and work on the machines. And we have evidence that some men were threatened with the sack if they didn't bring their daughters in to start work at the factory. At the time of the war, there were 6 main firms in Stony Middleton. They were mainly making boots, and 3 main companies in Eyam, which were mainly producing shoes. The fortunes of the local firms fluctuated as they faced competition from bigger companies, particularly in Northamptonshire, Leicestershire, other parts of the East Midlands, that had more modern machinery. But the overall growth of the industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries enabled local businesses to establish themselves. And one local newspaper described them as the thorn in the flesh of the bigger firms elsewhere. This was probably because their lower wages and longer hours gave them a competitive edge on prices. The industry was very much dominated by families, and if both on the employer side and amongst employees. And we've done an analysis of the 1911 census returns, and this is a typical one here, Barber family in Eyam, where you can see the father. I don't know if you can. I don't know if you can see that clearly enough, but the father, Tom Barber, in this case, was a warehouse man in a shoe factory, but he has children working in, four children working in shoe factories. And in fact, one of the younger children, who's at that point, 1911, is still at school, later also worked in one of the factories. And one of his sons also joined the army during the war. This is a typical setup. Tom Barber actually became very involved in the union. But from our analysis, we reckon that 4 in 10 households in the 2 villages had at least one person, and often several family members working in the trade. The Barbers are a good example of that. The working conditions in the factories were poor. When the main union organizer, who appropriately named Johnny Buckle, when he first came to the villages, he said they were amongst the worst he'd seen. And he was one of the national organizers. He knew the industry very well. He called it another Eyam plague. The typical working week around the start of the war was about 61 hours. In comparison, the national standard for hours was 52.5. But often women were taking homework to finish in order to eke out a slightly higher wage, so their hours were often longer than that. And when I listened to Kathy Hunt's talk, one of your previous meetings, and she talked about the sweated trades, there are a lot of similarities here to some of the other industries that Kathy talked about. You had intense labor conditions, poor working environment, low wages paid by piece, particularly for the women workers, a ready supply of labor, and a lack of trade union organization. And these were characteristic of both the factory and the home working in the villages at the time. I'm going to quote from one of the workers who wrote about the conditions in Eyam, and he said, "Girls who sit over sewing machines become round-shouldered and lose their eyesight by continual straining when the light is bad. One of the contemptible actions of our firm is refusing to light the gas at early morning or on a dull day." So often the girls or women had to bring in candles for themselves to light up their work. That quote was from this man here, Harry Dawson, who was a clicker at Ridgway Brothers for over 30 years and was sacked in 1918 for alleged union activity. He wrote a detailed description of the labor process in the factories at the time, which is quite unusual. It's a rare worker's eye view of what was happening. He was married to Margaret, who you can see here, who before the strike was periodically an outworker as well at home, stitching uppers on children's shoes for the factories when they had orders to meet. It was a practice known locally as felling. I don't know if you've come across that term in Nottinghamshire or elsewhere. It was very poorly paid. She gives an example of being paid 4p halfpenny for an evening's work in 1906. During the strike, their daughter Doris, who you can see here on the left, describes her mother vainly trudging around the bigger houses trying to get domestic work because they were desperate for money. And it was Doris who later wrote a wonderful memoir about growing up in Eyam at the time. And she wrote about the strike in her book called Tunes on a Penny Whistle, which I would recommend to anyone interested. She was later also one of the many daughters whom the employers tried to get into their factories by threatening their fathers. Now, the war obviously had a massive impact on the trade nationally and locally. I visited the Imperial War Museum to do some research, and they reckoned that about 47 million pairs of boots were produced in Britain, and most of those were produced in the East Midlands. The union representing the boot and shoemakers, which is, you can see on the side of this van, NUBSO, the national union the boot and shoe operatives, had something like a fifth of its members in the forces, something like 20,000, of whom over 2,500 were killed. And they were amongst many organizations that sponsored ambulances and other equipment for the armed forces. Most of the younger men in Eyam and Stony Middleton either joined the forces in 1914 or were conscripted in 1916. And then older men were brought in later on as the age of conscription was increased. Women workers then became a majority in the local factories, and that was a new situation, and some of them took on jobs previously done by men. Conscription was important because some of the firms were really struggling to carry on because so many of their workers had joined up. And when conscription came in, local employers would put appeals for exemptions for essential workers. You can see at the bottom of this poster, there are various categories for exemptions, including people who would be more useful in their present employment, and conscientious objection, which was recognized there for the first time. But when employees started joining the union, employers stopped putting in appeals for them, and that it was left up to individuals. This was quite a bone of contention in the villages, and seems to have been one of the factors in getting people to join the union, because the union could help represent them if they needed to make an appeal. In Eyam, we reckon about a third of men who signed up were from the shoe factories. And one of the companies in Stony Middleton, Higginbotham's, had a contract to make army boots. This is the building that was their factory. It's still there, it's been refurbished, but you can see on the outside of the building here, a hoist, what was the hoist for getting skins from drays, which would be bought, some of which would be bought from the nearby village of Grindleford, where there was a tannery. Another company opposite here, I don't know if any of you have been through Stony Middleton, but on the other side of the road is a company called Mason Brothers and Lennon, now called William Lennon. It's the last remaining factory, and they were engaged in repairs of army boots, which was also a massive operation at the time to supplement the production of boots. So, I'll just go back to that for a minute. Some of the women in the villages went to work in munitions in Sheffield. Other workers were transferred as substitutes to replace men who joined the forces. So there was quite a lot of movement of labour in the area. At least two of the local factories were shut for large parts of the war because they didn't have enough workers. And this is where the union first comes in, because previous attempts to unionize before World War I hadn't succeeded. But in 1916, NUBSO sent Johnny Buckle, who was then a local union officer in Leeds, to Stony Middleton to try and negotiate with this company, Higginbotham's, to make sure that they were paying the national rates of pay and adhering to national conditions, which was supposed to be part of the understanding with getting war contracts. And Buckle had some success. He got Higginbotham's to raise wages substantially to national rates, and they said they would comply with lowering hours if instructed to do so by the Ministry of Labour. However, he had less success in recruiting workers to the union at that point, but he did see the potential there, and he came back at the end of the following year to try and make sure that the rates have been maintained, but also to recruit for the union. And I think one of the reasons he was more successful in end of 1917 and early 1918 was because by that point, many more women had joined NUBSO and other trade unions. There was a massive increase, as I'm sure many of you will know, in trade union membership during the war. And in the case of the boot and shoe workers, a lot of it was down to this woman, Mary Bell, later became Mary Bell Richards. She organized the biggest union branch for women workers in the whole country in Leicester. She had about 6,000 members, and she was one of the first women on the National Council of the Union. And I think that the fact that women were joining the union in larger numbers would have given encouragement to women in Eam and Stony Middleton to consider joining the union where they hadn't done so before. I should mention, incidentally, there was also a breakaway women's union in the boot and shoe trade that started in Leicester. So, and between them and Mary Bell and others who stayed in Nubso, they forced the union to take the women's situation much more seriously. And in 1914, for the first time, there was a minimum wage established for women workers. Something like 20,000 women had joined Nubso by 1917. Now here you can see a picture of Johnny Buckle, the man in the middle with the bowler hat, who he was one of only 2 national organisers in the union, and yet he spent an enormous amount of time in Eam and Stony Middleton, much of it in his own time, I think, in addition to having to carry on all his other duties around in both in Britain and Ireland. This is a picture from one of the early strike parades, which is a fantastic picture, really, because it shows you how much the children were involved, how much it was very much a community event. You can see the men in their white uniforms here who were from the Eam Variety Band, and music was a big feature of the strike parades. So Buckle visited all the factories and set up meetings with the workers in the 2 villages. And the crucial meetings really took place early in 1918. He had one meeting for men and one for women in the Bull's Head.
Steve, your sound's gone off.
You've got,
Is it back? Steve? Steve, we can't hear you. Steve, we can't hear you.
Regrettably, Hilary, I think it may be.
Frozen.
I think it may be Steve's broadband connection has
Right.
dropped.
I think so.
Okay.
It's frozen. You might have to log
Yes,
off and log on again.
I've sent him a message, and we did have trouble with his Wi-Fi when we tried it out, but that was the vision. I've sent him a message.
I think he'd stopped talking, so I think he might be free to read the message. I think it turned on that there was a problem.
What I might do is come out of the.
Steve.
You're back.
Am I back?
Yes, we missed some of what you said, I'm afraid.
Okay.
The last, I think we lost you about the time when you just moved on from forcing the union to take the women's situation seriously. And then in the next bit, we just seem to lose you. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yes, that was the point about.
It might be an idea if we turned off our pictures.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I might turn off mine and see if that helps.
Yes, I think Steve, if you try.
Yeah.
Okay, hang on a minute. Right, I'm going to carry on speaking then and see if, can I go back on the PowerPoint, Alan?
Yeah, you can try going back on the PowerPoint. That should be all right.
Okay, hang on.
Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Can
thank
can
you,
hear you all
Steve.
right. You need
Yes.
to go on to the slideshow.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just get back onto the slideshow. Okay. Just give me a minute. I'll just get back onto the.
Okay, fine, Steve, don't worry.
There we are. That's it. Right. Okay.
Lovely.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just go back a bit because we missed something. Right. The point I was making, I think, was that as a result of Mary Bell and others, more women have become active in the union. They've recruited about 20,000 women by 1917. And therefore, by the time John Buckle went back to Stony Middleton, he was able to have much more success in recruiting people to the union, particularly women. And I was saying that two crucial meetings took place in in January 1918, where 46 women decided to join the union. And I think this was the decisive breakthrough, because that led to more women joining and then more men joining the branch. And because women were now a majority in the factories, it meant that they could begin to have some impact, which they wouldn't have done had the women not joined. However, it was still a very big decision for people to join a union in a small village, because the employers had an enormous amount of power in the villages. Not only were they being able to hire and fire workers, but many of them were landlords. They owned other property. They were influential people in the community. They were on the parish council. They were involved in the church, in inquests, and they mixed in social circles with the major landowners and other industrialists. So, is that? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to see if I can restart the video. Yeah, carry on. I'm going to quote a letter that was in one of the local papers, the Derbyshire Courier, which gives you a flavour of this. It's from one of the strikers. And he says, those who know the employers know that their deep-rooted objection to a trade union is because it means an end to their autocratic powers and an end to victimization of any of their operatives who dare to cross their wishes, either in the factory, the club room, the institute, or in the social or parochial life. I think that gives you a kind of insight. So it was quite a brave thing to do, to be the first people to join the union in a situation like that. The women's decision to join NUBSO was vital, though, because without them, the union wouldn't have got very far. The employer's response to workers joining NUBSO was swift and very stark. They sacked at least 11 workers, including two teenagers, who they believed were the main union activists. They also tried to get workers to sign documents saying that they wouldn't join the union, and they threatened to close factories if they didn't sign. The bosses refused workers' requests for shorter hours and payments of a war bonus, which had been agreed nationally. they wouldn't meet the top union officials who travel from London in person to try and persuade local employers to enter discussion. And it's worth noting that the General Secretary, the National President, and both national organisers visited and tried to see the employers. It showed you how seriously NUBSO was taking the dispute. The union saw the local employers as being completely out of line with the rest of the industry. And this was underlined when the bosses refused an offer of arbitration from the Ministry of Labour, despite the dire war situation. So the next slide, which if I can get it, it illustrates this point. Yeah, this is a letter written by the union to Sir George Asquith, who was the Chief Commissioner in the Ministry of Labour. He was the, if you like, the main troubleshooter for Lloyd George, whose job it was to try and resolve and prevent industrial disputes. And this was the second attempt the union made to get the Ministry of Labour to intervene, but the employers wouldn't take up the offer. Many of the workers wanted to strike straight away to get their colleagues reinstated, but John Buckle persuaded them to wait until the union's efforts to secure talks had been exhausted. Arbitration was the common practice in the industry and had been since the 1890s. And this was reinforced by wartime agreements between the government and unions, whereby strikes in essential industries were outlawed and all disputes were supposed to go to arbitration. The employers locally, though, weren't in the National Employers Federation and therefore didn't feel bound by those procedures. Nonetheless, the union wanted to ensure it had done everything possible to try and resolve the dispute before taking strike action. Hence this letter, which was very much at the last minute. We have to bear in mind also what was happening in the war at the time on the Western Front, where the outcome was very much in the balance, and the union didn't want to be seen to be doing anything that might undermine the war effort. However, the union also felt that it was their job to make sure that there were decent jobs and trade union rights on the home front and for soldiers returning after the war. Many union members, of course, had sons and in some cases daughters in the armed forces or other uniformed organizations. And there was a big debate in the trade unions and the women's suffrage movement at the time about how far you could or should go in taking action. Anyway, it was sensitive ground, but the union decided in the end that it couldn't let the employers get away with this. It wasn't a particularly militant union, but they were worried that if they allowed companies to pay low wages like this, they would undermine the other companies that had recognized the union and were paying the proper rates. So, in having failed to get the Ministry of Labour arbitration process accepted by the employers, the NUBSO decided to recommend their members to hand in their notice, and the strike was set to start on March the 7th, 1918. And here we can see another picture of the first strike parade. Right from the beginning, NUBSO organised parades through both villages to try and generate support in the community and from other workers, and to show the employers how much support they had. And the band I've mentioned already, and the parades became a major feature of the dispute. There were 4 demands that the union put forward: recognition of the union, a reduction in hours to 52.5, payment of a national war bonus, and the reinstatement of all those discharged by the employers for joining the union. Lively processions, including bands, were a feature, lots of community support. And Cathy Hunt, who spoke at one of your previous meetings, wrote in one of her articles about women workers striking in just before the war. She said they marched in their Sunday best, picketed, organized and raised funds with gusto. And for many women, strikes represented the first time in their lives that they had collectively challenged authority. And I think we can see echoes of this spirit in this and other photographs from the time. Here we can see an indication of the support that NUPSO got from other unions. This is from a picture in Stony Middleton, where some of you may recognize the banner. It's, I think it's a banner from the Workers' Union, and it's, they were organizing, especially amongst munitions workers in Sheffield. In fact, they had a women's branch in Sheffield, and they raised a lot of money for the strikers. Wages were very low in comparison to other areas. The wages for men were at the most 36 shillings a week, and that wasn't consistent. That was assuming you've got a full week's work in. In comparison, in Leicester, workers in the trade were earning 75 to 100 shillings, that's £5 a week. And for women, wages in the villages were around 12 to 16 shillings a week, close to the bone, as John Buckle said, whereas they could be paid up to 50 shillings a week in better organized districts. The hours were longer, working conditions were unhealthy. There was a survey done by the union at the time which said that the average age of death in the trade for men was 44 and for women 45. TB was notably prevalent, and so the demand for shorter working hours was especially important. So the Buckle sent out a circular appealing for support from other NUPSO branches and unions, and financial support started coming in, both from within NUPSO and from other unions. Now, this is an interesting photograph. I was asking Kath, I sent this to Kathy Hunt to see if she could shed light on who the women in the bottom right of the picture might be, because I think they're not actually strikers. The women strikers are over here. We think they might have been from the Workers' Union or possibly from one of the suffrage organizations who'd come over to show their support for the boot and shoe makers in Stony Middleton and Eam. So although they did get a lot of support, one of the crucial areas where they failed to get support was from the railway workers, because had the NUR got its members to refuse to load and unload goods on the Hope Valley line, then that would have given the strikers a big boost. I'm not sure why that didn't happen, because elsewhere, rank and file NUR members were very active in supporting strikes in other parts of the country. So I haven't got to the bottom of that that issue. However, the strike continued despite that. The members got strike pay. It was £1 for married men, 15 shillings for single men, 12 and sixpence for women. But with prices having doubled during the war, families were struggling to make ends meet, and they had to maintain their rent payments, especially because many members were living in homes owned by the employers or their friends. Eviction was ever present. Now, in this picture, you can see another banner, which some of you might recognize. This is a banner from the gas workers and general labourers, a union in which Will Thorne was the general secretary. The union had actually changed its name in 1916 to the National Union of General Workers. So this is an older banner, but they were another fantastic source of support for the strikers. And they raised a lot of money and representatives came over to Eam to give cash to the strikers. Various attempts were made to resolve the dispute in the early month. There was an intervention by a local vicar who invited strikers into his church, which was a very unusual event, probably the first time in Derbyshire that had happened. And he challenged the employers to using the words from the story of Cain and Abel, "Am I my brother's keeper?" He may have had one convert in that one of the companies, the one I mentioned before, who had the war contract, did agree to settle, but they were the only one of the 8 companies to do so. The union hoped that that would lead to other companies talking, were not realized. Will Thorne, who was the General Secretary of the gas workers and what became the general workers, actually came to Eam to talk, which was an extraordinary event in itself, to get the General Secretary of the largest union, he was also an MP for West Ham, to come and speak in a small village like this was obviously quite a significant event, and you can see the crowd there. And it's interesting to see the children here at the front as well, who I think were probably trying to sell sweets or other things that they've made to raise money for their families. Thorne also asked questions in Parliament about the strike and whether the Ministry of Labour could intervene. But their view was that they couldn't do anything. But if the employers refused to take part in arbitration, there was nothing further that they could do. There was then an attempt by a local magistrate called William Nixon to try and bring about mediation. He was appalled at the attitude of employers, but he too was unable to persuade the employers to take part in any talks. The employers seemed to think that the coming winter in 1819 would cause the strike to collapse. They were wrong. The strikers remained solid and continued the following year, right through the Spanish flu epidemic, which is obviously very relevant for today, but it killed more people in Britain. Over 200,000 people died. And we have evidence of at least 2 of the strikers who died from the Spanish flu, and a number of other people in both villages. A national agreement on wages and conditions in 1919 showed how far behind Eam and Stony Middleton firms were in comparison to the other areas. The minimum wage for men was raised to 56 shillings in 1919, and for women to 30 shillings if they were over 20. With piecework, it was expected that many workers would earn a further 25%, and hours were reduced to 48. So that's in comparison to the figures I mentioned earlier, the 36 shillings for men and 16 shillings for women. So the workers were faced with a dilemma because the strike was going on, the employers weren't responding, what should they do? They came up with the idea of setting up their own factory. And I've only found 2 photographs of this factory. They were in the Derby Mercury in 1920. But we managed to work out where this was. Hardly anybody in the village seemed to know that it had existed, but we've discovered where it was. And John Buckle managed to get this hut. It's an old army hut with some money loaned by the union, and they built the engine shed on the left-hand side there with a combination of strikers' labour and other people, workers they brought in and paid to do it. And the plan was to run this as a cooperative factory. They got support from the Daily Herald newspaper, and other unions sent money. And about 40 women were employed in the factory on proper union rates and the shorter hours. It was a welcome boost for them, and of course a massive improvement on their previous conditions. It was a contribution to help the families survive, but also it was a way of I think, of boosting confidence in the amongst the strikers and to give them something to work on to keep going in the face of the intransigence of their employers. And here's a picture from inside the cooperative factory. It was quite a novel experiment and quite a brave experiment in the circumstances. The plan was to extend and perhaps have another factory in the village as well, and to be able to employ everybody who'd been on strike. Sadly, that didn't come to fruition because of the economic conditions. The country was going into recession, and it was a very difficult time to run such a venture. As a result of the factory being set up and the failure to bring the employers into talks, NUBSO decided to call off the strike in the summer of 1920. Only one firm had settled with the union, but other companies were now paying higher wages and had reduced hours. And despite their earlier threats to union members and blacklisting of some workers, the firms did start to take back strikers, although they wouldn't recognize the union. The factory started off very successfully, but ran into difficulties, as I said, and eventually, and sadly, they had to wind up its affairs in 1923 because of the economic conditions. So, although the long struggle, which had started 5 years earlier, was now at an end, the strikers had still achieved a great deal, and they left a legacy which would be picked up by others and would bear fruit in later years. One of the legacies was that many of the strikers got involved in politics and helped this man to be elected to Parliament, Charles White. He was standing as an independent Liberal in a constituency that had been dominated by the Dukes of Devonshire and the Cavendish family for 300 years. And it was the first time that the Devonshires had been defeated in a general election. There wasn't a Labour candidate. It was a Liberal, independent Liberal, White, against the Conservative and Unionists. And in many ways, White was a good choice for the strikers because he refused to support Lloyd George's coalition with the Conservatives, and he voted largely with the Labour MPs in Parliament. Doris Coates said about the election that working people have challenged the rich and powerful and triumphed. The other crucial feature, of course, of this election was that women were voting for the first time in large numbers. Women over 30 with the right qualifications were able to vote. And White reckoned that the votes and the campaigning efforts of women in his constituency were a crucial factor in his success. The slide here also shows Hannah Mitchell, who was a local suffragette. She was born in the area. She moved to Stockport and became active in the Independent Labour Party. So the strike after the war, inadvertently or unintentionally, came part of a much bigger wave of social and industrial unrest which swept the country and lasted until 1922. It's quite an extraordinary period, actually. Something like 180 million working days were lost through strikes, and probably the most significant and sustained period of industrial action ever, and probably more significant than the general strike in 1926, and much larger than anything we've seen recently. And you had the police. Both of the police were on strike in 1919, trying to get a police trade union recognised, which didn't succeed. But there were big strikes in Clydeside for 40 hours, Belfast, and many other cities. This picture is from Liverpool, where tanks and battleships were deployed to put down unrest in the city in the summer of 1919. There were mutinies in 50 army bases of soldiers, and sailors and Air Force members who wanted to come back home, didn't want to stay in the army. Where the government obviously wanted to keep a large armed force together for other purposes in Ireland, in Russia, and in the colonies elsewhere. So one of the interesting features, I think, of that period of unrest was also the way in which workers in rural areas became organized for the first time. The boot and shoemakers in the Stony Middleton were just one example. Other workers joined the union inspired by the boot and shoemakers, particularly in the NUGW, and many factories and other workplaces in the area got organized. In World War II, the NUPSO got itself re-established, and in this instance, they managed to get all the remaining firms to recognize the union and to pay nationally recognized and agreed wages and conditions. And this picture is from one of the firms, Lennon's, and Pat Helliwell, who you can see here, became the union rep there, and the union survives to this day. It's now the community union, which NUPSO went through various mergers, and it's the last factory of those 8 which were involved in the original strike. Doris Coates said, I quote from her book, "My parents and their friends taught me how to survive through self-help and to fight injustice as they had done by their involvement in industrial action and political struggles." She went on, inspired by her parents, to become the first woman to be accepted onto a teacher training course in Goldsmith College in London, who hadn't been to grammar school. And that's a kind of example of the legacy through the families that came out of the strike. So, to commemorate 100th anniversary, we managed to get with various local groups and the schools in Eam, Stony Middleton, and we organised a commemorative parade in April 2018 on the same day as the church service that I mentioned earlier, when the vicar invited the strikers into St. Martin's Church, and the children made their own banners, as you can see here. It was a fantastic event, actually. Some of you, I think, may have been there. And we had a band, and we had a reenactment of the strike with some local residents doing their own. We invited unions to take part. We had the GMB, Chesterfield people came, Labour Party people came, and it was a great day. The well dressings, as some of you will know, are a great tradition in these villages. And one of our friends, Kate Upcraft, designed this extraordinarily well dressing based on a picture from the strike, and also incorporating suffragette colours. And I think it's a really good evocation of the events of 100 years ago, which were brought to a much wider audience through her efforts and others. We also made 2 exhibitions, one of which has been up at Eam Museum, but up until the pandemic, they had to take it down. But we've had a mobile exhibition that was we were going to take to Chesterfield Library originally with the Labour History Society, but we've taken it to many other venues when we've done talks, and it's been able to bring the story of the strike to a wider audience. Lastly, we've made 2 plaques to commemorate the strike. Because of the COVID, we've not been able to get these installed yet, although I'm hoping that later this year, if conditions are right, we'll be able to do the installation and have appropriate ceremonies in both villages. but we thought it was important to remember what had happened and to have it recorded in this way in both villages so that people passing through would be able to see the plaques. I mean, Eyam is an incredibly well-visited village. Hundreds of thousands of people come every year because of the plague. So people would see this. And in the light of recent debates about statues and memorials, we thought it was important that workers' strikes and disputes were recognised, particularly women workers. This was one of the most remarkable strikes in our history, because it is probably the longest strike involving a group of women workers in this country. I haven't heard yet of any that have been longer than this. I came across, I'll finish with this, I came across a great quote from an anonymous pamphlet written in the 1790s. It said, "The rich are named but not numbered, while the poor are numbered but not named." And we wanted to ensure that the workers were named. And in our book that Phil and I produced, in the back there and in the exhibition, we've got a list of all the workers that took part in the strike, joined the union at the time, because we wanted to name them. And we wanted to find a way to provide a more lasting and public recognition of their achievements. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was absolutely fascinating. I imagine, I'm speaking out of turn for the committee, but I imagine that we'd be keen to assist in any way at the placing of plaques in the villages.
That would be good, yeah.
We'll have to discuss it. Thank you. Right, now I can't see everybody who's attending on my screen at any one time. So would you please wave and keep waving? If you've got a direct question, there will be time later to make comments, but if you have a direct question, please wave now and keep waving. Right, there was somebody waving there. John Halstead. John, please ask your question.
Okay, I was interested that you put the photograph of the women up, and I think, was it the woman in the front of the procession? Was that Hannah Mitchell?
I don't know if Hannah Mitchell took part in any of the processions. I'm not sure.
Oh, well, you did mention Mitchell.
Yeah, no, I mentioned her because she was a local suffragette, and
yes, indeed.
in the context of the 1918 election, yeah.
Right, she was born in Alsopdale, I think, and her grandson, Geoffrey Mitchell, used to teach at the University of Sheffield in the extramural department, but he's died now, I'm afraid.
He lived in Hathersage, in fact, yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Okay.
Does anybody else want to ask a direct question? A lot of you have got your videos off, so it's a bit hard to see. Ian Hewitt, Ian, please ask your question. Can you unmute, Ian? Thank you.
Right, am I now audible?
Yes, you're fine now.
Good. I was really interested in the cooperative venture,
Yeah.
and wondered whether the co-op movement had been involved in any way, shape or form. Because I found by chance a record in 1919 in the Co-op News of a lot of political activity with the trade union movement and the various co-op societies to work cooperatively. So trade unionists would buy in cooperative stores and co-ops would support trade unions, and whether that filtered its way through. And finally, the Central England Society might be able to help with the blue plaque in terms of funding and stuff. There's a meeting on next week. I could perhaps mention it there and see if you could direct them to you.
That's really interesting, Ian. Yeah, there is some evidence that the Cooperative Wholesale Society helped the factory set up in the first place and provided some of the machinery, because they had, I think there were 8 cooperative boot and shoe factories around the country that I've about, and they were helpful. And at the end, I know that John Buckle approached the CWS to get some assistance because they were, they were struggling financially by the. What I'm not sure about is how far they were involved in actually providing work for the factory itself. I don't know about that. I know there was a cooperative shop in Eyam, in the village as well, but whether they gave any particular assistance to the strikers, I haven't been able to find out.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Julian, would you like to ask a question? Can you unmute yourself, Julian? Can you unmute yourself? That's it.
That's it.
That's it.
You'd mentioned how the Daily Herald had been involved. I just wondered whether earlier either ILP or Labour Party there'd been any involvement in the strike.
Well, I've been trying to find that out. I've not found any evidence of that directly. I don't think there was a Labour Party organisation in the area at the time. There's no records, not in the villages anyway. There was in Derby, certainly, where the one Labour MP who was elected then was Jimmy Thomas, who was the NUR General Secretary. He was the only Labour MP elected in Derbyshire. So I think there may have been individual members who came to support the strikers, but and there's reference in some of the local papers to Labour parades taking place, but I'm not sure if they meant Labour as in Labour Party or Labour as in trade unions. It's not clear. I did contact people who'd done research on the ILP to see if they had anything. They couldn't offer any particular suggestions. I mean, other people may be able to find this out. I welcome any suggestions on that. I've not managed to find any specific evidence. And of course, the Labour Party that was only just started in 1918 having individual membership. It was all done through affiliations prior to that, as I'm sure you know. So unless there wasn't an ILP branch in the Hope Valley, as far as I can see. But I welcome if anyone can shed more light on that. I'd be pleased to hear about it.
Thank you, Steve. I can't see anybody else waving, but I can't see everybody all at once. So, Alan Mark, please.
Roger Tanner, Hilary.
Sorry?
Roger Tanner.
Thank you. We'll have Alan first, please.
Steve, a simple question. How much did the unionists pay as a subscription at that particular time?
Now you've got me there. I can't remember off the top of my head, to be honest. I'd have to look.
Did they have dispensation whilst there was on the strike?
They had dispensation for the members who joined the armed forces. I think they were still paying during the strike. Yeah. I can't tell you the actual amount, Alan. I'm sorry. The union as a whole paid something like £8,500 in strike pay during the whole strike, which was an enormous amount of money at that time, and probably equivalent to several £100,000 in today's money. And most of the people who joined, of course, you're supposed to have a qualifying period before you got strike pay, but they seem to have the union seems to have taken a very helpful attitude to that, because they were paying strike pay out very quickly, even though not all the members would have been members for 6 months prior to getting the strike pay. So they certainly put an enormous amount into it, because they saw the potential for their other members being badly affected if they allowed companies like the 8 companies in Eamonn, Stone and Middleton to get away with paying much lower wages and getting war work away from perhaps where other companies would have got it. So it was a trade in which most companies were part of the Employers' Federation and did recognise the union. That's why this was so unusual.
Thank you, Steve. Roger, please.
Yeah, 2 things really. First one is on the question of families. You talked about that in your talk and in your book, and I'm just wondering whether you picked up any evidence of how far the families were important in getting people out on strike or joining the union or staying out on strike for that length of time. And then one other supplementary question. In your book, you mentioned about the vicar and the church service, about it being a link. It was a brief mention of Labour Church, and I was wondering whether he was actually a member of the Labour Church, because obviously he stood out as a C of E vicar in a village parish.
Well, on the families, I think certainly they were very important in generating support for the strike. And I think although it was St Martin's was an Anglican church, most of the strikers would have been chapel goers rather than Church of England goers, and the non-conformist chapels, I think, were really important as a way of promoting self-help and mutual support amongst the strikers. John Riddleston, who was, I don't have any evidence that he was a Labour Party member. I don't think he was, but he met John Buckle and was clearly convinced, as he said himself, of the justice of their cause, and was prepared to take on the employers, even though some of his main supporters were local employers, some of the bell ringers, for example, and people who supported the church. So he was prepared to confront them because he thought that the strikers were in the right on this occasion. Families, I mean, the families were also important on the employer's side, because there were family connections between some of the employers, so that they were obviously talking to each other and trying to act in concert with each other. There were some families which were split between people who supported the strike and those who stayed at work. And the same thing happened with returning soldiers, where some of them wanted to make a point of supporting the strikers and others were used as strike breakers. So it was quite a contentious issue within both villages. Although the majority of the workers came out and supported the strike, there was a small minority that didn't, and were therefore able to keep some of the factories going during the strike.
Thank you, Steve. I can't see any other. John?
Just a couple of small points. One's a question in relation to the priest. Did he owe his living to any local landowner in any way? And the other point that just occurred to me is that in relation to the ILP and the Labour Party, 1917, of course, was the year of the foundation of the Cooperative Party. I don't suppose anybody of the locals were associated with the or in the Cooperative Party, but just a thought.
I don't know. I haven't got any evidence about the Cooperative Party, John. I'm sorry, I don't know about that. As far as Riddleston was concerned, I don't think he was. I think he was, well, all parishes had their own systems for appointing vicars, but he had been there a long time.
Right.
But in fact, there are remarkably few vicars in Stony Middleton. His father had been there before, and I think he was a vicar for about 50 years in total. So I think he was pretty well established. He didn't have to worry about anybody. In Eyam, it was slightly different, where the local vicar was very much in league with the employers, and the employers wanted to. An earlier vicar in the village had been much more outspoken, and they got rid of him. But in Stony Middleton, it was different, and I think quite unusual. The Derbyshire Times, I think it was, said this was the first occasion in which a Church of England vicar had invited a body of strikers in and welcomed them to the church.
Thank you, Steve. I can't actually see anybody else wanting a question, but I think we're
somebody waving there, Hilary.
Anne Donlan.
Okay, well, let's start with
Judy.
Judy, because I can see Judy, and then we'll move on to Anne.
Thanks. Going back to families, you said that the men who worked there were asked to bring their daughters into work.
Yeah.
I wonder if you found out how common it was for both parents to be working in the same place, which would obviously mean there'd be no income in the house, both working there. And secondly, what's happening to their children at this time? I'm a bit ignorant on where we are on schooling and this and the other. Do we know where they fitted into this while their parents were either on strike or not on strike? And as I say, how common was it for both parents to be working in the same place, or the whole family to be working there?
I think it wasn't very common, Judy. I've looked at the census. Most women who were working in the factories would work from when they left school, say about the age of 13 or 14, up to their late 20s, or until they got married. Most but not all married women seemed to stop working at that point, mainly because they had families to look after themselves. And it's quite unusual to have a married couple working at the same time in the same place. However, some of the women were doing work at home. They were out working as well, supplementing wages, or they were doing other work, maybe part-time. But there were some older women involved in the strike, but they seemed to mainly be single women, as far as I can make out. As far as children were concerned, during the war, I think children played a really important part, perhaps something that isn't quite sufficiently appreciated, in working in factories, but also they were doing odd jobs to raise money for their families, running errands for neighbours, that kind of thing, just trying to earn coppers to supplement the family income. And also they took on, the older ones took on much more responsibility in the factories with the men being away in the forces. So a lot of teenage, 15, 16, 17-year-olds would have been doing quite responsible jobs in these factories, but also in other in other industries. So they were a source for the families that had somebody on strike. The rest of their family were very important in bringing in money to help sustain them during the strike. Some of the strikers did get other work as well when they were on strike to supplement the income. That some of the men, for example, worked in other trades, sort of casual work to earn money, so that they could keep going in the main dispute.
Thank you, Steve. Anne, your turn. Would you please unmute so we can hear you? Thank you, Anne.
Yes, I'm just wondering whether it's possible to say more, Steve, about how the employers were able to hold out. That issue of scab labour interests me in terms of how it was managed and facilitated. The effect also on the community, thinking about the 84-85 strike, and how in Mansfield and in Nottinghamshire, that still divides the community, that is still there. So just in there, I know you did mention scab labour and the fact that some people did continue going to work, but just wondering whether you can say a little bit more about that, about how it was managed, were they brought in? Anything more you can say about that would be very interesting.
I don't think they were particularly brought in. I think most of the workers that, well, there were two elements. One was workers who didn't join the union. In some cases, because they were bribed or threatened by the employers. There's evidence in Doris's book of people being given food, for example, like fish, as to encourage them to stay and work. They were also threatened, you know, with not getting their jobs back. And, you know, people were in dire straits and they wavered as to whether to join the union or not. And the other side of it was employers using their own family members, extended family members, and bringing some of them in to work and doing more actual work themselves as opposed to just being the employer. So that being more hands-on. And then the third element, well, which I mentioned, were returning soldiers, some of whom were recruited as strike breakers. But they were people who had previously worked, as far as I'm aware, in those factories beforehand. I don't have any evidence of people being brought in, especially from outside, to work in the factories. And in the case of William Lennon's, which is the factory that's still there, we did some digging around. They kept some archives from the time, and we found out that the factory was closed for 6 months in 1918 to 1919 because half of the workforce, half of the male workers had joined the forces, the others were on strike, and the factory couldn't continue for that reason. And the employer was desperately trying to get he had one son who was killed in the war, and he's trying to get his other son out of the army to help him reopen the factory. But they couldn't, the army wouldn't release him because like many other soldiers, they wanted to keep as many in as they could for other purposes after the end of the First World War.
Thank you, Steve. Barry Donlan, please.
Yeah, briefly on the same theme, because of 1918, 1919, is there any evidence of a role played either way by war widows?
I'm not sure what have you got in mind there, Roger? Sorry.
Well, by 1918, the death toll was enormous. 1919, we have vast numbers of people, of families, who no longer have a male breadwinner, but whose wife, married, captured children, was, for sociological reasons, didn't go to work before then.
Right.
Was there any notice of any change?
The only thing I came across was that I mentioned Charles White being elected in 1918. One of his major campaigns was to improve the lot of war widows, and he made this a big issue in his election campaign and after he was elected, to try and make sure that they were properly provided for, and that the government, the level of support was raised after the end of the war. I don't have any evidence that they were used to break the strike, or that in any other way. I mean, there were obviously local soldiers who were killed who would have had widows left behind, and the union would have supported them if they were members of NUBSA. And the union carried on supporting people for some years, in fact, after the war, if they were unemployed or needed any other kind of benefit, they couldn't get work. But I'm afraid I can't add any more than that.
Thank you, Steve. I think we've been through a whole range of questions. I can't spot anybody else waving at me. Perhaps we could move on to anybody who wishes to make comments. based on the talk and issues that arise out of it. I will keep flicking through the gallery to try and spot wavers. Don't hesitate to wave while somebody else is speaking, because I can't see all of you all at once. Ah, Phil. Can you?
Hi.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just a quick comment. I didn't realise till recently that the shoemakers were one of the oldest trade unions, because they go, as Steve said right at the end there, they go well back into the 18th century. Possibly have combinations, you know, even before that. But I think because I've been doing a little bit of work about early trade unions under the combination laws from 1799 to 1824. And it was a trial of shoemakers for conspiracy in 1799 that led up to the passing of the first Combination Act in 1799. So they go, and they certainly had a rule book back in those days. I don't know whether the union's still going. Maybe Steve can let us know, but they're certainly one of the oldest trades with a union.
Well, NUBSO was formed in the 1870s, but it was a combination of other unions that had existed much earlier, as you say, Phil. I mean, there were a number of different sections of the trade that were organised, but the modern union, as it was by then, had been going for about 45 years or so by the time of the war. I think there were still some other smaller unions, for example, in Lancashire, in Rossendale, where they had their own independent shoemakers union, and there were other smaller societies that still existed. Eventually, they all merged and became part of later versions of the union. But at that time, NUBSO was the main one, and they had about 70 to 80,000 members during the war.
Thank you, Steve. I'm flicking through looking for anybody else who wants to comment. Can't see anybody at the moment, so maybe I can just throw in a comment. You said you thought that this strike was probably the longest running one of any that involved particularly women workers. There was a Keaton strike in Sheffield that started in the 80s. I'm not at all convinced that there were a lot of women workers, but as far as I know, that Keaton strike was never settled. And I believe the company's out of business now. So it never was settled. Neither side would budge.
That's right, Keaton. So it went on for about 8 years. The Keaton.
Yes, yeah.
It wasn't. There were longer strikes of male workers. In this strike was the longest in the footwear trade in England, I think.
Yeah.
I mentioned it as a group of women workers. Now, a lot of people will know about the Gramwick strike, which was a strike by women workers that lasted just under 2 years. And there may be others that I'm not aware of, but as far as a strike involving a significant group of women, this was one of the longest, I think, if not the longest. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Did I cut you off there? Were you going to say something?
Sorry, no, that's it.
Right, fine. I'm flicking through, looking for anybody else who might want to speak. Will anybody who does unmute themselves and call out, please, because I can't see anyone.
Hi.
Hilary?
Judy.
Hi. Just for information on the union side, I'm pretty sure all those the original footwear unions would all have ended up joining in KFAT, which then combined itself with, anyone that doesn't know, when they decided it was a slightly declining industry, they combined themselves with the remains of the steel union, thinking that they had an interest in supporting their local communities, which is why they call themselves community, which is why they then joined up. So that's the history. On Grunwick, I was there. I went practically every day. Jeremy Corbyn used to come and pick me up and take me over there because it was my union. As somebody who worked for a trade union, we were in Apex, which then became the GMB. and which was quite a right-wing union. But when you went to their conference, which I did as a delegate, they were suddenly so proud because they suddenly had this big dispute that they were supporting, and they suddenly had their place in the union movement. And I remember being there when the mine workers and others came down in support on a big event with the Gromwick workers. It was quite an amazing thing. And the Trico strike, the equal pay one, I can't remember how long that went on. I think it was quite a long time.
Thank you, Judy. Yes, I was in Apex when I was an NUM staff member, and we were supporting the strike by doing all we could for it, and we just ignored Apex and ploughed our own furrow. There is, of course, the Unite community branches now that will cater for people who are not actually in work or retired. Does anybody else?
Yes, Hilary?
Yes, Alan?
Yeah. Steve, you know the photographs that you showed of the strikers and families, all of them were well shot. Was this a sort of a bonus that bootmakers could in fact have done on the quiet so that their children had shoes? Because when you look at social photographs of the time, at that particular time, there is a lot of barefooted children shown around in different parts of society.
I don't know. I think what happened was that a lot of them did their own work at home. I think, you know, people mentioned before, so they would have either made shoes or repaired shoes or boots for their own family. But they weren't getting that from the company, because we know from the records we saw at Lennon's that people had to pay for their own boots, and they had a system where you could pay so much a week or so much a month over a year or 2 years to pay for your boots, so that although the factories were producing for wholesale purposes, individuals could also purchase, but they weren't getting them for free. I think that certainly from Doris Coates's account, it was very much a family affair. So the reason why they perhaps had shoes, boots, would have been pairs that their fathers or mothers had actually worked on to keep going for longer, or to improve in some way, rather not necessarily a new pair, because that would have cost too much.
Right. Because I've had front gates made at the factory that I worked at, made out of scrap metal, you see. And I'm just wondering whether or not bits of leather and nails and stitching was accrued that way.
It was quite common to have a cobbler's last at home. My father was a joiner, and he mended our shoes using the cobbler's last. And I think that was a fairly common.
Yeah.
Does anybody else want to make comments? I'm flicking through and can't see anybody.
Julian.
Roger?
Julian.
Julian, please. Julian, are you muted?
He is, yes.
Yeah, can't find the...
You're okay now?
I can hear
Yeah,
you.
okay.
No, Julian, carry on.
Sorry, this is not... this is another one of our advertisements for ourselves, and that is that we really are looking for contributions to our newsletter, that we're eminently flexible on this. It could be just a short little report of something going on in your area, or an aspect of labour history you're intending to deal with, or it could be something more substantial, say up to 2,000 words, again, fitting into our general remit. If you have stuff like that, most of you will have received emails from me. Just send me back that material.
Thank you, Julian. Now, I can't hear anybody else coming forward.
Well, just one point, if I could, Hilary.
Yes, certainly.
That recently there's been an initiative within the co-op movement, picking up on some work that was done by United Steel to establish something called union co-ops. They've generated a sort of manifesto, but have found it difficult to relate to the bigger unions. But the unions that they have managed to work more closely with are what's left of the cobblers, footworkers union, and the community. So that's, I mean, there's a sort of tie there. But it turns out there was a conference, a Zoom conference, and it turns out these American union co-ops are maybe more a figment of the imagination of some people over here rather than a tangible thing. But there is a latent interest, and it does strike me as a possible avenue for the future, especially given Steve's report today.
Thank you, Ian. I don't know if any of you know, but in South Wales, after the colliery closures, Cower Colliery continued as a co-op, but it wasn't able to survive given the world market, but they did have a go. Now, anybody else? I'm flicking through. Did somebody say something? No, I can't see anybody else. So unless somebody's going to call out, I'm going to move to
Anne.
Sorry?
Anne.
Anne. Sorry, I can't see Anne. I've lost Anne now. Please speak, Anne.
She needs to unmute.
Unmute. Can you unmute, Anne?
Is it announcement time, Hilary?
Yes, I think so, yes.
So just really on the same theme of encouraging people wanting trade unions to join trade unions and become active. Unite NG 57 is currently sponsoring 50 places for people who are unemployed or retired and who would like to join a trade union, So that is available through Unite. And then the Nottinghamshire Mining Museum Limited, which was set up as a people's mining museum to remind people that in Notts we had to struggle to defend our pits and our jobs, has a new website, www.nottsminingmuseum.org.uk, and the details are in the chat.
Thank you very much, Anne. I take it nobody else is bursting to come in. I can't see or hear anything. So all that remains now is for me to thank both Steve for his fascinating research and brilliant talk, and to thank all of you for participating, and to thank those of you all of you who've been patient with our technical difficulties, and those of you who've helped others to speak because I haven't spotted them. So thank you to all of you. And I'd like a bit of applause for Steve, please. Thank you. And for Alan for technical help.
Hey, thanks, Steve.
Very much.
Very good.
Thank you and goodbye to everybody.